Welcome to A Matter of Priorities. I'm Alice Obrecht, your host. On this podcast series, we've been exploring the significant pressures facing humanitarian aid agencies as funding for humanitarian action is falling at a time when crises are multiplying. We're now recording this episode after the closure of USAID in January of 2025, which has wiped billions of dollars off the ledger in foreign aid almost overnight, and was followed by the announcement of significant budget cuts by the Dutch and the UK shortly after. We are now hearing the Emergency Relief Coordinator for the UN, Tom Fletcher, call for a humanitarian reset, and the sector is revisiting the definition of what is a humanitarian need and what is the role of humanitarian aid in the future. But these are not new topics, and if you've been listening to the previous episodes of this podcast, you'll know that the sector has already been engaged in this line of questioning for well over a year, with humanitarian country teams using a boundary setting exercise last year in the development of the humanitarian response plans to try to focus on a smaller number of targeted people. At the outset of this boundary setting exercise in 2024, we spoke with Hugo Slim, the esteemed humanitarian ethicist who wrote 2 papers on the issue of prioritization and redefining humanitarian need. One of these papers was produced with REACH, the independent needs assessment and research organization that produces a lot of the needs assessment figures for humanitarian country teams. Here's Katie Ricard explaining why REACH commissioned this think piece from Hugo Slim and the kinds of prioritization challenges they see arising in crises.
It's deeply urgent right now. I think the reason why we want this to be a wider conversation and why we asked Hugo Slim to write that paper in the first place is at the moment, it feels like these really ethical choices about who counts as in need, what type of needs we should be prioritizing or not, are being kind of delegated to this very technical sphere where we're thinking about, which indicators we should measure, which thresholds we should choose. And of course, those questions are really important and technically complex. But before we get to that level, we should be first thinking kind of actually what types of need are more important than others. Should we prioritize life-saving assistance over longer-term recovery efforts? And how do communities' own perceptions of what's important get factored into this? And just to give you an example of kind of how this plays out in practice, recently in South Sudan, we saw displacement, large-scale displacement across a border. Most communities wanted to stay in the location that they had displaced to because they perceived it to be safe, and they really needed quite acute assistance to kind of prevent potential loss of life for them in the new location where they had arrived. However, there were some that were reporting that they were willing to send their children back to a location across the border that was deemed as unsafe at considerable risk to their children's lives in order to access long-term education opportunities. And this kind of poses a really difficult ethical dilemma. Do we prioritize short-term assistance? Okay, that might save some lives in the short term, but clearly populations are kind of themselves willing to put their own potential lives on the line in order to access this longer term good. And it has implications on how we measure. Do we measure acute malnutrition and mortality rates, or in that circumstance, should we be worrying about the quality and quantity of education services provided? So these are the types of questions I think we should be having as a sector out loud, more explicitly, so that then they can inform the way that we measure and choose to assess populations and understand better their needs and their priorities and preferences.
So these are really thorny, tricky questions, and exactly the questions that are on everyone's mind today. And this is why we were delighted to speak in detail with Hugo Slim on his proposals last year. Since Hugo's thinking on this is so rich and our conversation covered so many interesting areas, we have split his interview into 2 parts or episodes. In this episode, we discuss what is a humanitarian need, what are the 6 different approaches to defining needs that we've seen in our sector, and what are the 3 core questions that donors and agencies should be asking now to get a clear understanding of what humanitarian need means. In the next episode, we include a conversation we recorded with Hugo a few weeks ago to get his reflections on the U.S. cuts and more recent developments. For now, here's our conversation on redefining humanitarian need based on Hugo's 2 papers.
Yeah. Hello, Alice. Very nice to talk to you. So I'm Hugo Slim, and I am a senior research fellow at the Las Casas Institute for Social Justice at Blackfriars Hall at the University of Oxford.
So you write in the paper that was published by the Norwegian Center for Humanitarian Studies that, and I'm quoting here, a new approach to the definition and prioritization of humanitarian needs is strategically urgent, end quote. And you talk about the limitations of the current approach, which you've described quite provocatively as a Christmas tree of humanitarian need. Can you tell us, what do you mean by the Christmas tree approach, and why is rethinking our definition and prioritization of need important now?
What I mean by the Christmas tree, and it's a terribly culturally, centric image, but what I mean is that it's a thing we keep adding more decorations to, if you like. So, we know from the original sphere standards that there's sort of shelter, food, water, health, etc. And over my lifetime, we've just added more and more needs to this thing. So, we have an extraordinary range of needs now that are impact needs, like mental health, like education, like protection, which has grown enormously in protection of almost every human right in humanitarian thinking. And we have process needs, which are added on too. So how are you going to do this? You're going to do this with community engagement, with participation, with all sorts of processes, which also get added on if you're, familiar with Christmas trees. That could be the tinsel, the lovely stuff that you fold around the tree, and then the needs of the sort of decorations that you put on it. But it's a very cluttered tree now. It's got a lot of fruit on that everyone's meant to be concentrating on and trying to address. And I suppose my concern about that is it's been over the last 10, 20 years when there's been a lot of money in the system, actually, and it's been a boom period over my lifetime. It's been possible for people just to say, right, this is now a humanitarian need, and get money for it and start a new little team for it in their bureaucracy and expand it, and the whole thing becomes exponentially bigger.
Right, because now, of course, we need technical advisors to help develop the policies around that need or theme. Yeah. Your paper talks about 6 different approaches or theories of humanitarian need. Can you just briefly run us through those one by one?
So when I was writing the paper, I sort of was looking at the humanitarian sector, and I was thinking, what is their theory of needs? And it struck me that they're probably using sort of a mixture of 6. So the first one is basic needs theory, that actually, it goes back to Maslow and other people, that, as humans, we have basic needs at the bottom of our pyramid of life, which are for sort of, safety, security, food, water, shelter, and social relations of some kind. So that's the basic needs approach. The second is the more sort of ancient idea of goods, that, to have a good life, you need certain good things. And they overlap with basic needs, but it includes more social things like friendships and things like education, that part of the good life is trying to enrich your mind and understand your place in the world, et cetera, et cetera. So the theory of human goods. But the other thing about goods is that it's been, extended by economists in the modern era to think about public goods. So we can think about public goods from which we as individuals all benefit, like water systems, good government, educational systems, an ecosystem, and all these things. So we have that idea of goods, private goods and public goods. The third idea, of course, is well known to humanitarians, particularly if they've done a master's course, because it's Sen and Nussbaum's approach to capabilities. So it's Amartya Sen and particular saying, actually, we don't just need lists of needs. That just makes everything a commodity, that you need food, you need this, you need that. And it makes the process of development very commodified, and makes people very passive. So his theory is that, in fact, the thing to develop and help people to develop is capabilities. That means taking away obstacles, like low education or poor markets or low credit and financial inclusion, take away those obstacles and help people develop capabilities with which they can meet their own needs. So that could be education. Freedom is a big thing for him, that they can associate and form groups and companies and businesses and these things to prosper. And then the fourth one is rights, human rights. And in a funny way, you can think that human rights really is the politicization of those needs, goods, and capabilities. So, if I need food, I politicize that need by making it a human right and agreeing a political contract with government and saying government must help me secure my need for food, my access to food, and the same with education and our capabilities and things. So that's rights, and there's a lot of rights-based humanitarian aid. And the fifth one is liberation. There's a consensus that actually what, in a sense, people really need to meet their needs is revolution and the finding of a just society. And that involves liberation of consciousness and freeing a person's consciousness to understand why they're poor and that they're poor and why the system is wrong. And then leading a process of change with that new consciousness, a liberated process for people to find a way to meet their needs and have a fairer society. So I think probably liberationist humanitarians are probably people who have said that the system itself is flawed, the humanitarian system itself is flawed, and it's run by a largely white, dominant bourgeoisie, if you like, and hegemonic class of international humanitarians from the West. And that system will never really help people meet their needs. It'll keep them as needy people getting supplies from humanitarians. Therefore, we need to decolonize that system and, raise people's consciousness to resist those big international institutions and form their own and find their own solutions. And then the last one is the sort of disaster one that comes to us through the disaster risk reduction community and the Sendai framework, which is resilience. And that's, reached quite critical mass in the last few years. And will go on doing so. That's the idea that what you really should be aiming for is resilience. So you need to look what helps people being resilient, and those become critical factors, and you focus on those. So, in a simple way, it might be protection from hazards like storms and floods, or it may be different kinds of resilience by realizing that people can only really survive if they have good systems around them for health, education, etc. So you say you must have resilient systems which people can draw on as they survive.
So these are the 6 different normative approaches to thinking about humanitarian needs that Hugo has seen across the sector. Moving into the more practical realm, Hugo's argument is that there are 3 central questions that must be answered by any donor or agency that's trying to produce a practical way of defining and prioritizing humanitarian need.
I think they are: what is a distinctly humanitarian need? How wide is the range of humanitarian need? And how shall we prioritize between different needs and different people in need?
We then asked Hugo to talk us through his answers to these 3 questions. So, once again, starting with question number 1, what is a distinctly humanitarian need?
I feel that, with a lot of money and with a lot of ambition, the humanitarian sector over the last 10, 20 years has become quite utopian, actually. And it's become, in the jargon, very much an optimizing project, which seeks to optimize every aspect of people's lives, rather than a satisficing project in which you're trying to satisfy the basic things that people need. So I thought it was important to say, right, if you're going to call it humanitarian need, then you should take that word need seriously. And if need is in the impartiality principle, which it is, that you work on need alone, then what is a need? And I actually tend to agree that a need is rather a basic thing. And I therefore argue that a humanitarian need should be something which relates to what some philosophers call your vital interests, and vital as in life, the vita in Italian, in Latin. It's a life interest. Without that met, you will have harm to your life and risk death. So in my paper, I argue that we need to go and really look seriously at the idea of needs and stick to them. So that means a humanitarian need is something that is necessary to a human life, not just beneficial. And that's why I then make a distinction between life-saving and life-keeping, that humanitarians should be focusing, working with people to make sure that their life continues and that they can keep it at a certain level. they shouldn't be so much focusing on life making, which is the bigger process of flourishing and finding ways to make life richer and richer emotionally, physically, economically, etc. So I take the word need in its hard sense because I think humanitarians have to, because of the principles of humanity and impartiality. They make quite clear in humanity that their job is to protect life and health and ensure respect for the human being. That's pretty basic to me. So that is really a vital interests and basic needs. And in the same way, when they talk about impartiality, how will they decide between people? They say, we're going to decide on need alone, especially the most serious cases of distress. So they are really working at the hard lower end of the idea of a need. And I think that's good. That's where they should stay. And the other reason to stay there is that they're not going to have a lot of money in the future. And they're going to have a lot more people to try and help. So I would stick to vital interests and necessary programming, not optimizing programming. That's my sort of core commitment around what is a need.
Okay, so according to Hugo, a humanitarian need reflects a vital interest. So let's move to question number 2. How wide is the range of things that count as a vital interest? In other words, how big is the bucket?
So the next thing I tried to do was to help humanitarians simplify the Christmas tree. So instead of having endlessly incremental needs, which you add on and add on and add on, and having this really vague, frankly, incoherent approach across the sector about what is a humanitarian need, I've tried to focus down and say, well, let's talk about 4 areas of need, which really hit upon those vital interests as things necessary to life-saving and life-keeping, and not things that are beneficial to flourishing and life-making as an optimizing project. So the first area is health need. And this obviously focuses on bodily needs. And it does that because unless you protect the body, it will die. But it also does that because health is a basic precondition for meeting all the other needs. If you're not healthy, it's going to be harder to meet your social needs and, survive and find ways to become resilient. So health is important to protect life, and it's important as a precondition to meet all the other needs. And of course, we can then say that health is made good by being safe and not under attack, so safety, food, clean water, shelter, sanitation. And then we have a simple dial on the dashboard, if you like, which is health, and which includes those things which create good health. And then the second area is social need. So people, to live a life, we need people around us. Yes, we're all individuals, but we only really can live in a community around us. So I think it's very important to identify social need as the second major humanitarian need. And again, in a sense, there's sort of 2 types of that need. There's that lovely sociality and, the Latinate word conviviality, where we live with each other. And that includes friendship and family and community. And people need that. They need to be part of a family and friends and a community to live convivially. But the second kind of social need they have is for associations of some kind that help them thrive. And so that's businesses, political groupings that organize things, the way they live, and cultural things that make them happy and live with a certain identity. And of course, those 2 types of social need are met today virtually and physically. So to respond to those as humanitarians and help people keep and save that social life involves engagement, helping them engage in physical space, but it also means helping them engage in virtual space in the way we deal with each other so much now, as we are in this interview, remotely through technology. The other thing I say that is important to remember in a social need is respect. And I use this word because respect is in the principle of humanity, whereas dignity is not in the original version. So if people feel known in a community, if they feel valued, if they know others, if they're actively playing a role in their cultural life, in their livelihoods, in their educational life, etc., they have a sense of self-respect and they are more likely to be respected. And so for respect for the human being, which is part of the principle of humanity, in many ways emerges from social need being met. The other thing there also is the concept of humane treatment, which is, a social treatment in a way, the way we treat each other. And in particular, things like prisons and IDP camps. Humane treatment then becomes a social need, and humanitarians often have particular responsibility for humane treatment in the way they work with people, the courtesy they show them, and the way they understand specific treatment for people of different ages, genders, and abilities. So that's the social need bit. The third thing, I pick up the idea of capabilities theory, and I say really what is the third need people have is survival capability. So here we can think about all the things they need to know, and all the things they need to be able to do and understand to survive in climate emergency in particular. So elements of numeracy and literacy, certain skills, and this gives them the capability to anticipate, reduce, and adapt to climate hazards and risks. So this, for example, enables them to contribute to early warning systems and anticipatory aid systems, and to understand them and use them. So all sorts of survival capability, I think, is a third big need that humanitarians should focus on. And they should just think of it like that and do many things to achieve and help people achieve survival capability. And then the fourth one is systems need. Because, of course, none of us can really, unless we're Bear Grylls, I suppose, none of us can really survive without systems around us from which we draw our survival capability and we draw our resilience, in fact. And these are economic systems like markets and supply chains, but they're also, by which we can make a living. They're also infrastructure, energy, electricity, health, water, transport, communications, education, health and things. So we need systems. And that's why I point out very firmly that the fourth big need we have as human beings to survive are systems. And that includes the ecosystem. So a lot of things humanitarians are now doing around nature-based solutions is helping people ensure an effective ecosystem around them. And that's very important. So health needs, social need, survival capability, and system need. And I think together those will save life, increase respect, and enable resilience. And so those are the sort of meta goals that we have in meeting needs. And I think it makes a simpler dashboard for humanitarians. Rather than having endless blooming lines of things, you can focus on, are we helping people to meet their health needs? Are we helping them to meet their social needs? Are we helping them to increase their survival capability? And are we supporting the system needs they have for various different systems? I think it might make life simpler.
So, do Hugo's proposed ideas for simplifying the humanitarian Christmas tree work? Let us know your thoughts by leaving us a comment on our social media channels. Or if you want to be part of the conversation through this podcast or by writing a commentary, please reach out to us at comms@alnap.org. That's comms@alnap.org. And make sure you join us for the next episode, where we explore Hugo's answer to the third question on how needs should be prioritized, as well as look at some challenges in his approach to limiting the scope of humanitarian need. We will also check in with Hugo to hear how he has updated his thinking since last year in light of the massive cuts to humanitarian funding. Thank you for listening to A Matter of Priorities, a podcast by ALNAP. For resources and links related to what we've talked about in today's episode, please check out the description. For more information on ALNAP, please visit our website, www.alnap.org. And if you enjoyed this episode, please hit subscribe to our series wherever you get your podcasts.